He was barely breathing. A 1-month-old golden retriever puppy, soaked, trembling, left to die at the edge of a cold, silent lake, wrapped in a plastic bag. No name, no mercy. Just discarded like a mistake. People walked by. The wind howled, and still he cried, soft, broken cries no one heard. No one until... Before we begin, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and if you believe abandoned animals deserve better, hit that subscribe button, because what happened next, you won't forget it, ever. The wind moved softly over Willow Lake like a hush, brushing the water into faint ripples that shimmered beneath the dull light of an autumn sun. The sky was a flat sheet of pale gray, clouds heavy with cold, but holding back their rain for another day. It was the kind of day where the world seemed to wait for something, though no one quite knew what. The trees along the banks had mostly shed their leaves, leaving twisted black limbs reaching over the water like old hands. The earth smelled of wet bark and dying things. Elias Granger rowed slowly through the southern inlet, his oars dipping into the water with soft, familiar rhythm. His boat, a battered aluminum shell older than some of the trees that lined the lake, creaked with every shift of his weight. The sound was comforting, predictable. Out here, he didn't need words or clocks. The lake moved at its own pace, and Elias had long since surrendered his need to control anything faster than the wind. At 68, Elias bore the shape of a man who had once stood tall and broad-shouldered, but had begun to curve with time. His back hunched slightly, not from injury but from the wear of too many years spent alone. He had once worked with machines, carburetors, outboard motors, combustion engines, and the scars on his knuckles proved it. Now, his hands were stiff with arthritis, his movements deliberate and slow. His hair, what little remained, was a dull gray that curled behind his ears, and his beard, cropped but scruffy, clung to the grooves in his weathered cheeks. His pale blue eyes, framed by deep creases, had the distant glaze of someone who had grown used to speaking only to himself. He lived in a one-bedroom cabin just north of the lake, a place tucked into the trees like it had always been there. Lorraine, his wife of 32 years, had chosen it. She had loved the view of the water, had said the sunsets made the world feel like it was starting over. She died in that cabin 6 years ago, a stroke in her sleep. No warning, no goodbye, just silence. And then more of it. Since then, Elias had floated more than lived. His days were built of coffee, toast, feeding the crows that gathered near his porch, and these aimless rides across the lake. He didn't fish for food or sport anymore. The rod lay by his side because it always had. Habit. Comfort. The illusion that something was still biting. He chewed on a piece of jerky, the salt sharp on his tongue. Around him, the lake breathed in slow currents. A duck called from somewhere beyond the reeds. A distant motor from across the lake rose and faded. Otherwise, silence. Then he saw it. A dark shape, tangled near the shoreline where the reeds grew thick and dense. Something small, lumpy. He paused mid-chew and leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. It wasn't moving. He reached for the oars and rowed closer, curiosity tugging at the edge of his mind. As he approached, the thing seemed to rise and fall slightly, bobbing in rhythm with the water. A part of it was pale yellow. Fur? A blanket? His breath caught. He pulled the boat closer, slowed his approach. The shape was caught in the reeds, waterlogged and slumped at a strange angle. As the boat slid alongside it, Elias leaned over the side and reached down with both hands. It squished between his fingers, a black plastic garbage bag, torn, heavy with water. Something soft slipped from its side as he lifted. An old towel, stained and rotting. The smell hit him like a punch. Spoiled food. Mold. He cursed and dropped it back into the reeds, wiping his hands on his coat. "Damn kids," he muttered, scowling, "ruining a good place." He sat there for a moment, watching the bag drift lazily in the reeds, half sunken. He had felt something twist in his chest when he'd thought it was an animal. A dog. For half a second, he'd thought maybe he could help. That was the worst part of aging, how even hope started to feel like a betrayal. He shook his head and turned the boat. He didn't see the other bundle, just around the curve of shoreline, maybe 20 yards away. It lay half on the muddy slope, half in the water, hidden behind a fallen tree and a tangle of weeds. There, barely clinging to life, was a golden retriever puppy. no more than a month old. Its fur, once a soft gold, was now dark with water and lake muck, clinging to its ribs like wet rags. Its body was curled tight, as if trying to shield itself from the cold, from the silence, from everything. The puppy shivered once, then again. Its tiny chest rose, fell, struggled. Its mouth opened with a soft gasp, as if crying out, but no sound came. Its voice had gone hoarse from hours of screaming no one had heard. Its paws twitched in the mud. The pup's eyes blinked open, cloudy and weak. The sky above was gray. No warmth. No figure approaching. Only reeds swaying and the wind's empty song. The pup's gaze shifted sideways, instinct searching for movement, for mercy, for anything. Nothing came. The shallow breaths grew shallower still. Its limbs loosened, its head sank further into the muck. And just before its eyes slid shut, it saw something across the water. A boat, drifting away, oars rising and falling. It didn't know what it meant. It only knew that someone had been near, and now they were gone. Elias rode on, unaware, his thoughts already drifting back toward the stove he'd need to light before nightfall, the can of soup he'd planned to open for dinner, and the creak in the porch step he kept forgetting to fix. The lake behind him returned to stillness, and a fragile life, hidden in the reeds, waited for something that would not come. Not yet. Elias Granger hadn't planned to row back. The sun was dipping lower now, melting into the tops of the trees across Willow Lake, and the gray haze overhead had started to thicken. He had soup to heat, a fire to build. He didn't like returning late, not because there was anyone waiting, but because the dark made everything too quiet. Still, something tugged at him, a thread in his chest that wouldn't settle. Maybe it was the way the reeds had moved, or that whisper of sound earlier. Or maybe it was nothing at all, just an old man's mind kicking like a dying engine. But the feeling rooted in his spine, and before he knew it, his hands were back on the oars, turning the boat in a slow arc back toward the southern bend. The boat drifted along the waterline, creaking like it always did, reeds brushing its sides as he slid closer to the shoreline he thought he'd already seen. Then, as he rounded a narrow jut of land, he caught it. Just a flicker of gold, no bigger than a loaf of bread, pressed low against the mud and weeds. At first, he thought it was another piece of garbage, a soggy stuffed toy maybe, or more of that cursed towel from earlier. But then it moved, barely. Just a tremble of breath, a twitch of fur. Elias's heart stalled mid-beat. He dropped the oars and lunged forward, pulling the boat sideways toward the shallow water. The hull scraped against something underwater, but he didn't care. His boots plunged into the cold lake without hesitation, water soaking through his socks and chilling his legs to the bone. He waded through the reeds, both hands stretched forward, and knelt beside the fragile shape. A puppy. Golden retriever, drenched, cold, covered in muck and sand and algae, barely a month old. Its ribs were visible through the soaked fur, its chest rising in the faintest rhythm. Its nose bubbled slightly with breath. Too slow. Too shallow. One eye fluttered, then closed. Elias didn't speak, didn't curse. Just reached down and scooped the creature up with trembling hands, cradling it against his chest. The fur was wet and icy, the body so light, so terrifyingly limp. "Come on, little one," he muttered, voice cracking under the weight of sudden urgency. "You hold on." He moved quickly, pushing through reeds and back into the boat, the puppy wrapped inside the flap of his coat. His heart thudded violently in his chest. This wasn't how he moved anymore. This wasn't the pace of his world. But now, it was the only thing that mattered. 10 minutes later, the boat scraped against the dock. Elias climbed out, legs stiff and trembling, carrying the pup close to his chest. The old wooden planks groaned under his weight as he hurried across the yard and into the cabin, the door slamming behind him with a loud, unfamiliar bang. The inside of the cabin was still cold. He hadn't lit the fire yet. He laid the pup on an old flannel blanket near the hearth and rushed to stack kindling. The fire sparked to life with an angry hiss. Heat spilled slowly outward. Elias peeled off his coat, then returned to the puppy and wrapped it in a second blanket, folding it tightly like swaddling. His hands shook. It wasn't enough. He needed help. 15 minutes later, Elias pulled up in front of the Northridge Veterinary Clinic, a small one-story building with a red tin roof and windows that glowed orange in the early evening dim. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he ran toward the front door, soaked, carrying the bundled pup like something sacred. The door swung open before he reached it. A woman stepped out, tall, narrow-shouldered, wearing blue scrubs and a thick braid of dark auburn hair pulled behind her back. Her name tag read Lucy. She was in her early 30s, with soft hazel eyes and freckles across her nose. Her expression shifted instantly from professional calm to urgent concern. "Emergency?" she asked, already holding the door wider. "Puppy!" Elias rasped. "Cold, barely breathing." She took one glance at the small lump in his arms and motioned him inside. "Let's go. Nora's in back. Follow me." The inside of the clinic was warm, clean, scented with antiseptic and lavender. They moved through the hallway quickly. A second woman emerged from a side room, Dr. Nora Ellison, veterinarian and clinic owner. She was in her late 40s, medium height, with a strong build and short silver blonde hair that framed a sharp, intelligent face. She wore glasses with thin gold rims and had the eyes of someone who'd seen too many heartbreaks but still tried to save everything she could. "What do we have?" she asked, snapping on gloves. "Golden retriever. 1 month maybe. Found half drowned in the reeds," Lucy answered, as Elias carefully laid the pup on the stainless steel exam table. Nora bent over the bundle, already reaching for tools. "No collar?" "Nothing," Elias said. "Nothing but mud and bones." "Get the heat pads. Warm IV. Let's go." For the next several minutes, the room was filled with purposeful movement. Oxygen tubes, a small heated chamber, saline dripping slowly into the pup's leg. Lucy gently massaged the paws, while Nora listened closely to the chest with a stethoscope. "He's hypothermic," Nora muttered, "but he's fighting." The puppy gave a soft cough, weak, but it was sound. Elias stepped back, standing against the wall. His coat dripped water onto the floor. His hands were clenched. For a moment, all he could do was watch. There was something unbearable in the stillness of that tiny chest. Something too familiar, too close to a memory that never stopped echoing. He cleared his throat. Can I name him?" he asked. Nora didn't look up. "That's your right." He hesitated. "Theo," he said softly, "short for Theophilus, means beloved of God, I think. Or maybe just meant to live." Lucy looked over, her eyes misting slightly. "It suits him." The machines beeped softly. The heat lamp glowed. The puppy didn't open his eyes, but his breathing grew slightly steadier, one fragile beat at a time. Nora finally stepped back and peeled off her gloves. "You got to him just in time, Mr. Granger," he said. "Elias Granger." She nodded. "Well, Mr. Granger, if you were 5 minutes later, we'd be talking about what you found, not what you saved." Elias's throat tightened. He didn't answer. And across the room, beneath warm light, a fragile life took its first steps back toward the world. The clinic hallway was quiet. Only the occasional hum of the heating vents and the faint beep from the oxygen monitor filled the silence. Outside, a soft drizzle pattered against the windows, the kind of steady rain that blurred the world into a watercolor of gray and brown. Elias Granger sat on a hard vinyl chair beside the heating unit, eyes fixed on the small glass chamber where Theo, now dry and bundled in a faded blue towel, lay breathing. The puppy's tiny frame barely rose and fell beneath the heat lamp, but it was movement. That alone was a miracle. His fur, though still dull from lake muck and cold, had begun to lift slightly in texture, no longer glued to the skin. His paws were curled, twitching gently in what could have been sleep or instinct. His eyes remained closed, his mouth slightly parted. Elias leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees, watching each breath as if counting seconds between lifelines. He hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the boat. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a deep fatigue that clung to his shoulders. But there was no way in hell he was leaving. Not now. Not after this. Lucy had offered him a blanket hours ago. He had refused politely, then regretted it silently. His coat was still damp around the hem, and his socks were cold inside his boots. But the discomfort barely registered. Every so often, a small mechanical hiss would release warm mist into the chamber, and Theo's nose would twitch at the scent. He still hadn't opened his eyes. Not once. But Elias believed he would. Dr. Nora Ellison entered just before dawn. Her short blonde hair was slightly tousled now, glasses perched lower on her nose than earlier. She wore a gray wool sweater over her scrubs, and a paper cup of coffee steamed in her hand. She moved with calm precision, but the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed the hours. "You've been here all night," she said softly, not surprised. Elias didn't look up. Didn't feel right going home. She walked over to the glass chamber and checked the IV. Vitals are steady. He's warming from the inside out now. That's good. Elias let out a breath. He twitched a little, in his sleep maybe. That's a reflex. But sometimes reflexes are a good sign. She paused, then glanced at him. We'll keep him under observation until midday. If his body temperature stabilizes without support, he can go home. Elias's brows drew inward. Home? She didn't press, just nodded and moved to update a chart. An hour passed, then 2. The sun finally broke through the rain clouds, casting pale beams across the linoleum floor. Elias dozed off in the chair without realizing, head tilted forward, breath soft. When he woke, Lucy was there, crouched beside the chamber, holding a small dropper near Theo's mouth. The puppy stirred beneath her hand. "He's lapping a little," she whispered with a hopeful smile. Her face looked softer in the daylight, her freckles catching the light. "I added broth." He seemed to respond to the smell. Theo's tongue twitched again. Just once. But it was real. Elias leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. "He's still in there?" "He's not giving up," Lucy said. "Neither should we." For the next few hours, they took turns checking on him. Lucy prepared a warm rice bag and tucked it beside the pup's flank for heat. Elias held the dropper, one drop at a time, feeding him slowly, carefully. When Theo stirred and let out the smallest sound, a hoarse, scratchy noise like a broken whisper, Elias blinked back tears he hadn't realized were forming. At noon, Nora returned, checked the vitals again, and nodded. "He's not out of the woods, but he doesn't need to be in a chamber anymore. If you can keep him warm, hydrated, and rested, he'll do better at home. Less stress." Elias swallowed. "I have a stove, blankets. Then he's ready." They gave him instructions, a kit, meds, small syringes for feeding, a checklist of symptoms to watch for. Lucy handed over the blue towel bundle herself, her hands lingering on the fabric. "He's got spirit," she said quietly. "He just needed someone to see it." Elias didn't know what to say, so he nodded. "Thank you, both of you." By the time he stepped out into the weak midday sun, Theo in his arms, the drizzle had stopped. The air smelled of wet pine and diesel from passing trucks. It was the kind of moment that felt like it shouldn't exist, like something fragile had slipped through the cracks of fate and made it anyway. The drive home was slow. Elias cranked the heat and rolled slowly through the winding road that led back to his cabin, glancing down at Theo every few seconds to make sure he was still breathing. The puppy lay curled in the towel, one paw resting against Elias's arm. His nose twitched, and his ears flicked once. Back home, Elias stoked the fire before even removing his boots. He laid a soft flannel blanket near the hearth and gently placed Theo on it, adjusting the bundle like it was glass. Then he sat on the floor beside him, legs crossed, hands on his knees. "Never thought I'd do this again," he murmured. Years ago, Lorraine had begged for a dog, something small and loyal, but they'd ended up with a clumsy old Labrador from a shelter who had a crooked tail and a love for peanut butter. His name had been Buddy, and for 7 years, he'd followed Lorraine everywhere. Garden, kitchen, porch. When Lorraine died, Buddy refused to eat for days. Then one morning, Elias found him lying in her spot on the bed. Quiet. Still. Gone. He'd buried Buddy under the elm tree with his own hands, and he'd sworn that was it. No more dogs, no more paw prints in the hallway, no more grief with fur. But now, here he was, watching this tiny, trembling thing breathe in front of the fire, watching as one eye cracked open, just a sliver, and looked directly at him. Theo didn't move much, didn't whimper or wag, just looked, and Elias couldn't look away. The morning broke quiet and dull. The light filtering through the pine trees outside Elias Granger's cabin was soft, nearly colorless, casting faint pale streaks across the hardwood floor. A light fog lingered over Willow Lake in the distance, brushing against the water like breath over glass. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, giving off the low, steady warmth of a hearth that had done its job through the night. Theo lay curled up near it, a bundle of golden fur, his chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. The towel around him had slipped slightly during the night, revealing more of his small frame. Elias knelt beside him quietly, careful not to disturb his sleep. He gently dipped a corner of a clean cloth into warm water from a bowl on the floor and began to wipe along the pup's side, removing the last of the mud and debris. The pup stirred slightly, one ear twitching as Elias continued. The fur was softer now, clean and gold like autumn wheat. But as he reached for the small patch of fur beneath Theo's neck, something made him stop. His fingers brushed against a ridge. At first, he thought it was bone, but when he parted the fur more carefully, his chest tightened. A dark, thin line ran along the base of the puppy's neck, hidden beneath the fluff. It was faint, but deep. A scar. A ring-shaped depression, raw in places, healed in others. Not accidental, not natural. A rope. Elias sat back slowly, cloth dripping in his hand, staring at the pup now with new understanding. He had been tied. He reached out again, softer this time, letting his palm rest just near Theo's shoulder. The pup didn't flinch. That alone broke something in Elias. He hadn't thought much about how Theo ended up in that lake. He'd told himself maybe it was a mistake, a lost litter, someone irresponsible but not cruel. Now, he wasn't so sure. Later that afternoon, Elias bundled Theo into a fresh towel and laid him gently inside a box lined with fleece and old shirts, then placed it on the passenger seat of his truck. The clinic had asked for a follow-up checkup, and Elias hadn't argued. Truthfully, he wanted answers too. When they arrived at the Northridge Veterinary Clinic, Lucy met them at the door. She was dressed in her usual navy scrubs, hair tied in the same loose braid, but her expression brightened instantly at the sight of Theo. "Well, look who decided to keep breathing," she smiled, reaching in to scratch lightly under Theo's chin, and looking a little smug about it too. "He's got more attitude than I thought a few pounds of fur could carry," Elias muttered, stepping inside. Lucy led them into the back room, where the walls were lined with charts and medical equipment. She placed Theo gently on the scale, checked his weight, up by a few ounces, and ran her fingers along his ribs with practiced care. She murmured softly to him throughout, a habit she didn't seem aware of. Her voice was warm, like a stream on a quiet day. When she reached the neck, though, her fingers paused. She parted the fur, looked up, and met Elias's eyes. "You found it too?" Elias nodded slowly. "This morning." Lucy turned, her voice quiet but firm. "That's not from a collar. That's a pressure line. Rope or wire, something tight, something left too long." She wrapped Theo again and placed him gently in Elias's arms. "This wasn't someone forgetting a puppy in the woods." Elias's jaw clenched. "Then what was it?" Lucy hesitated. "You ever heard of the Tucker Mill case last spring?" He shook his head. "There was a woman, lived 2 towns over, ran a backyard operation selling unregistered dogs. Said she was breeding them, but she was pulling them from shelters, street pickups. Some were stolen. She'd keep the good-looking ones for sale. The rest? Disposed of." Elias blinked slowly. "Disposed," Lucy nodded grimly. "Drowned, shot, dumped in boxes behind the gas station. I helped with some of the intake when they raided her barn. I remember the scars, the burns, rope lines just like this one." Silence settled in the room. Theo yawned softly, oblivious to the weight gathering in the air around him. "You think someone—" Elias began. "I think someone didn't want him to live," she replied quietly. "But I also think they didn't expect him to be found. Or fought." Elias felt a slow heat rise in his chest. Not the helpless kind that had haunted him since Lorraine passed. Not grief, anger, protective and sharp. "What can we do?" he asked. Lucy pulled out a folder from the cabinet and flipped through pages. "Let me reach out to a friend of mine. She tracks abandoned litters and suspected illegal breeders. If Theo was part of something, we'll see if there are others. Or records, tattoos, microchipped fragments, anything." "I'll help however I can," Elias said. Lucy gave him a small nod. "Then we'll start with asking the right people." Back home, as evening fell, Elias sat near the fire again, Theo asleep across his legs. He stared at the scar on the pup's neck, now barely visible beneath fresh fur. He'd seen scars like that before. On men who'd survived things they didn't speak of. On his own arms, from machines, from accidents, from moments of weakness. They all told stories, but none of them ever came from something so small, so undeserving. He thought about Lorraine again, about the way she had spoken to plants as if they were people, about how she'd cried watching a goose lose its mate in the sky. She would have taken one look at Theo and pulled him into her arms without a second thought. "You got her eyes," Elias muttered. "That same damn fire." Outside, the wind began to rise again, stirring the trees around the lake. But inside the cabin, warmth spread gently across the floor, curling into corners long left cold. It had been 7 days since Elias had pulled Theo's limp, soaked body from the reeds of Willow Lake. 7 days of warming bottles, sleepless nights, and watching over the little golden bundle that had, without asking, taken up residence not only in his home, but deep in the marrow of his days. Theo was recovering slowly, still tired more often than not, but stronger, eating from a bowl now, limping along the wooden floor on wobbly legs, and barking once in his sleep, which nearly made Elias drop a mug out of surprise. But the scar hadn't faded. Not yet. And neither had the ache in Elias's chest. It was a clear morning when the thought returned, quiet and stubborn, like a splinter he'd never removed. Something was off. That scar. The garbage bag he'd found floating a few yards away. The position of the pup's body. None of it felt like coincidence. Lorraine had once told him that his gut was smarter than he was. "You're too stubborn to notice," she'd laughed. "But your instincts? They're usually right." So he packed a small canvas bag with gloves, a folding knife, a flashlight, and an old pair of binoculars, then loaded Theo into the crate in the truck's back seat with a soft fleece blanket and a piece of Elias's old flannel shirt. "I'm not leaving you home alone," he muttered, glancing at the rearview mirror as he backed out onto the gravel road. "You'd eat the kindling." Willow Lake shimmered beneath a pale sky by the time they arrived. Elias parked at the south access point, the one near the bend where the reeds grew thick. He left the window cracked and the truck in the shade. Theo gave a low whine, but curled into the blanket and fell asleep before Elias had even reached the trail. The old path was soft with mud and flattened grass, marked with faint tracks from deer and birds. Elias walked slowly, eyes scanning everything. The bark, the water line, the base of every tree. The wind rustled gently through the cattails, and the air smelled of moss and cold iron. When he reached the inlet where he had first spotted Theo, he stopped. The reeds had shifted, grown thicker, and some now bent awkwardly in strange directions, as though someone, or something, had stumbled through in a hurry. Elias crouched near a gnarled root that jutted into the shallows. A few feet away, caught under a sun-bleached branch, was something pale blue. He waded in, boots sinking into the muck. Reaching out, he freed the fabric. It was a strip of ribbon, frayed, half-torn, knotted at one end. Faint paw prints were stamped into the dried mud nearby. Elias held the ribbon in his palm. It was almost identical in color and texture to the one that had been tied around Theo's neck when he was first rescued, except this one was soaked in dark residue, as if it had been dragged through oil or algae. Further up the slope, another shape caught his eye, duller, tangled among brittle roots. He crouched again and gently tugged free a length of rope, caked in mud and stiff with age. It had a frayed end and a loop tied at one side, the knot hardened from time and exposure. Elias stared at it a long moment. This wasn't just rope for a dock or trap. It had been fashioned to restrain something, or someone. He stood slowly, a quiet dread creeping into his gut. No animal chewed through that. No hunter left that by mistake. It wasn't trash. Someone had tied something here. Someone had come to this bend in the lake, this hidden, overgrown shore, and used this rope. And if Theo had once been attached to it, he looked out over the water, saw the gentle current rolling away from the inlet. There were no drag marks, no prints indicating a scuffle, only stillness and faded memory. But the signs were there. He picked up both the ribbon and the rope, folded them into a cloth, and tucked them into his satchel. As he stood, a sudden crack of underbrush made him freeze. He turned, one hand already on the handle of his folding knife. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, wide-framed, with a tan ranger's vest and long arms swinging at his sides. His beard was thick and flecked with gray, and a wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over deep-set eyes. The man raised a hand. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. His voice was gravelly, but not unfriendly. Name's Dwight Slater. I'm the seasonal warden for this section. Elias exhaled slowly, straightening. You always sneak up like that? Dwight chuckled. Only when someone's crawling through reeds holding rope like a crime scene. Elias nodded toward the water. Might not be far off. Dwight studied him. He was in his early 50s, stocky, with large calloused hands, the kind of man who looked like he had built more fences than he'd opened books. His face was sun-worn, his skin freckled and leathery. You find something? Dwight asked. Elias hesitated, then pulled out the ribbon and rope. This was here, near the same spot I found a puppy last week, tied up, nearly drowned. Had this same ribbon on his neck. Dwight's expression darkened. We've had rumors, he said. People dumping animals. Mostly cats in boxes. Once or twice. Worse. Like a puppy strung up with rope and thrown in the water? Dwight nodded grimly. Could be the same hand. Elias watched him. You know who? Dwight scratched his beard. There's a place 2 towns over. Used to be a mill, turned into a junkyard. Guy named Rick Travers runs it. Real quiet type. Keeps to himself. But folks have seen strange things on the property. Burned barrels, barking at odd hours, cages. You ever go check? Tried. He's got permits for scrap and kennel holding. Stays just this side of legal. Elias tucked the cloth back into his satchel. I'm not looking for a fight, but I want to know where that rope came from. Dwight looked at him, something respectful flashing behind his tired gaze. Then let's keep looking. By the time Elias returned to the truck, Theo was awake and sitting up, tail thudding softly against the crate wall. His eyes were brighter now, curious, almost expectant. Elias reached in and scratched between the pup's ears. We're going to figure this out, he said quietly, one knot at a time. The day had started unremarkably. Gray skies thick with tension, the kind of weather that couldn't make up its mind. It was late afternoon when the wind shifted and brought with it the smell of rain. Elias Granger had just finished chopping firewood and was halfway through clearing the pine needles from the roof gutters when he heard the first low rumble of thunder roll over the ridge. At 68, climbing the ladder was no longer a graceful affair. His joints cracked, his balance wavered, and his breath came shallow after each trip up and down. But Elias was stubborn. The roof had leaked the last time the rains hit, and he didn't intend to let it happen again. Theo, now visibly stronger, had taken to following him around the yard, his tail wagging lazily, nose twitching with curiosity. The little golden retriever was still thin, fur patchy in places, and his gait had a slight limp. But his eyes sparkled now, and he no longer whimpered when touched. Elias had begun to talk to him more often. Short sentences, little updates, sometimes stories from the past. There was no one else to hear them, and Theo, attentive and wordless, listened better than most humans ever had. The first drops fell as Elias reached for the final gutter spike. They pattered gently at first, then increased with a sudden urgency. Rain's coming fast, he muttered, beginning his slow descent. Lightning flared briefly in the distance, casting stark shadows across the clearing that surrounded the cabin. By the time Elias reached the back porch, the drizzle had become a curtain. He dropped the gloves into a rusted tin bucket and turned toward the door, only to realize Theo wasn't behind him. "Theo!" he called, voice sharper than usual. "Inside now! Come on, pup!" Nothing. Rain beat louder. The trees around the clearing swayed, their branches hissing with wind. Elias stepped off the porch, boots sinking slightly into the softening earth. He whistled, short and high-pitched. Still no response. Then, just beyond the vegetable patch, he heard it. A bark, shrill and panicked, followed by another and another, each more urgent. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the flashlight from the porch crate and pushed into the trees, slipping slightly as the mud grew slick. The flashlight beam cut through the mist like a blade. The barking grew louder, more desperate, until it abruptly shifted into a low growl. He found Theo not far into the woods, standing stiff-legged in front of a thicket of thorny brush, teeth bared, his little body trembling but resolute. The fur along his back was soaked, plastered to his skin, and blood streaked his chest and legs from cuts too small to stop him, but too many to ignore. "Theo!" Elias dropped to his knees beside him. The growling paused, replaced by a quick yelp, and Theo turned briefly toward Elias before returning his attention to the bushes. Elias pushed the flashlight beam forward and saw what had caught the dog's attention. A kitten, soaked to the bone, wedged deep inside the thorns, its orange and white fur barely visible beneath a coating of mud and burrs. Its tiny body shivered violently. One of its front paws was trapped between two snarled branches, the joint already swelling. Elias's breath caught. "Oh, kid." He moved carefully, using his gloves to push aside the thorns and gently extract the little creature. The kitten mewled once, a pitiful sound, then went limp in his hands. Elias tucked it against his chest and turned to Theo. "You did this?" he whispered. Theo leaned forward and licked the kitten's ear. Back at the cabin, Elias wrapped the kitten in an old flannel and lit the stove. He worked with care, drying the kitten, warming goat milk, and trimming thorns from Theo's coat, and whispering soft nothings he wasn't sure either of them understood. The kitten's breathing steadied, and eventually it curled against the towel beside the fireplace, too exhausted to fight. Theo lay nearby, his legs bandaged, his head resting heavily on Elias's boot. The little dog didn't move much, but his eyes stayed open, always watching, always aware. It was hours before Elias allowed himself to sit. He slumped into the rocking chair Lorraine once used. Her shawl still hung on the side, untouched for years. Tonight, he didn't move it. He simply leaned back, stared at the fire, and let the tears fall. They came silently. Tears for Lorraine, for all the words unsaid, for the years he'd spent sealing himself behind walls of grief and routine. And now this little dog, barely healed, barely grown, had run out into a storm to save something smaller, something weaker. He had risked his life again. Why? Elias didn't know, but something inside him cracked, the wall shifted, and for the first time in over a decade, Elias whispered into the room as if someone were still listening. "I'm proud of him," he said hoarsely. I think you would be too." The fire crackled softly in response. By morning the rain had stopped, the sky washed pale. The kitten was still alive, and Theo had slept peacefully, curled like a question mark around Elias's slipper. Outside, the woods were still damp, the leaves dripping quietly. But inside the cabin, it was warm. Warmer than it had been in years. The mornings had shifted. Where once the air held only the biting silence of old wood and empty chairs, now it vibrated with the soft padding of Theo's paws across the cabin floor and the occasional mewl from the orange kitten, now named Pip, who had claimed a folded blanket as her throne beside the fireplace. The end of autumn brought thin mists over the hills, and frost gathered like powdered glass on the porch railing, but inside Elias's home, warmth bloomed from more than fire. Theo, now approaching 10 weeks old, had filled out. His fur had regained a healthy golden shimmer, no longer dull and sparse. His eyes, once clouded with confusion and fear, now gleamed with cautious curiosity. His ribs no longer showed. He walked with a little more confidence, even if a slight tremble lingered in his back legs from the ordeal. Yet, what changed most was his spirit. He followed Elias room to room, resting at his feet while the old man read, snuffling beside him while he tended the fire or curling beneath the rocking chair during long silences. But it was outside that the healing truly began. On one pale morning, Elias stood at the front door, weathered hands gripping an old braided leash. He had found it in a box buried beneath blankets in the attic, once used for Marley, the dog he and Lorraine had raised in their middle years, before sickness dimmed their laughter. For a long while, Elias had considered burning the leash, but something had stopped him, and now, here it was again, soft from time, but still sturdy. He bent down and clipped it gently to Theo's collar. "Let's see what the world looks like now, eh?" he murmured. Theo looked up, tilted his head, then stepped forward hesitantly. Their first walks were short, circles around the cabin, to the edge of the woodpile, back to the garden. Theo was skittish. The crunch of leaves startled him. A squirrel's leap sent him cowering. But Elias never rushed. He moved slowly, murmuring stories from another life, letting Theo smell every stone, every twig. By the end of the week, they had reached the forest's edge, and by the next, they stood at the lake. It was there that Theo froze. The lake stretched wide and silver under the morning light, its surface calm and endless. Elias could feel the tension in the leash tighten as Theo stared, legs rigid, tail low. "You remember," Elias said softly. Theo took a hesitant step forward, then another and another, until his paws were just touching the damp shore. He didn't whimper. He didn't flee. Instead, he sat down, staring at the lake, head tilted like one listening to a language only he could hear. It became a ritual. Each day they ventured a bit farther. By the second week, Theo was trotting confidently, sometimes even tugging the leash with excitement. Pip, too small for long outings, watched them leave with theatrical disdain, then meowed loudly when they returned. It was during one of these walks that they met Sarah. Sarah Westfield was 34, lean and tall, with tightly coiled chestnut hair, usually bound into a loose ponytail. Her complexion was sun-kissed, cheeks dotted with freckles, and her gait was one of someone used to moving fast, restless, capable. She worked at the local library 3 days a week, but her real passion was rescue work. She'd fostered over 20 animals in 4 years, and her house, set on a low ridge not far from Willow Lake, was known in town as the Second Chance Ranch, though she laughed at the name and said she couldn't even keep her succulents alive. Elias first saw her crouched near the trailhead, trying to coax a scared stray with a piece of jerky. Theo's ears perked up. He sniffed, then whined, and Sarah turned. Their eyes met. "You must be Elias," she said, straightening. "Lucy told me about you, and about this brave little guy." Elias's brows furrowed slightly. "She talks a lot, that girl." "She does, but only about people she respects." Sarah extended her hand, firm grip, no nonsense. "I'm helping Lucy organize a small group, rescue-minded folks. You'd be perfect." Elias chuckled under his breath. "I'm not much of a group man." "You are now," Sarah said with a grin. "Blame Theo." The following Sunday, Elias found himself in the back room of the veterinary clinic. The meeting was informal. 6 people, some with folders, others just with coffee. They ranged from a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who rescued feral cats, to a teenage boy named Kevin, who spent his weekends searching abandoned sheds for injured animals. At the front stood Lucy, bright-eyed as ever, clipboard in hand. "I know we don't have much," she said, "but what we have is heart and stories. Let's build from there." Elias didn't speak for most of the meeting, but he listened. When it was his turn, he simply said, "I found him," or "he found me." Doesn't matter which, but it mattered that someone did. After that, things changed. Lucy created a shared database for tracking found animals. Kevin offered to map high abandonment zones. Sarah printed flyers, and Elias, though still quiet, began keeping a notebook, jotting sightings, odd noises in the woods, unfamiliar prints near the lake. Theo, now fully off leash, walked beside him like a shadow with golden fur. His fear of the lake had faded. He even dipped his paws in the water once, causing Pip to yowl from the shore in protest. Back at the cabin, Elias installed a second feeding bowl. He repaired the old dog bed. He cleaned the windows. Lorraine's photos remained where they were, but now they looked less like relics and more like memory's breath, watching over something new. One night, as a light snow began to fall, Elias sat by the window, sipping tea. Theo slept at his feet, Pip curled in the crook of his armchair. Outside, a fox darted past the fence line, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. "You brought me back," Elias whispered into the silence. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Theo, or Lorraine, or both, but the warmth in his chest didn't need an answer. The first snow had arrived in Fairhill, soft and hesitant, dusting the tops of fences and piling like powdered sugar on pine branches. It gave the lake a quiet reverence, a breathless hush, as if the world held its breath for something unspoken. Elias stood at his cabin window with a cup of weak coffee in hand, Theo dozing by the hearth. Pip sprawled on the windowsill, watching flurries dance in the wind. Life had settled into a rhythm, or so it seemed. That morning, a knock shattered the silence. It was rare for visitors to reach Elias's cabin. The road was long, winding, and snow-covered this time of year. But there, on the front porch, stood a man, a stranger, clutching a folder and a leash. He was tall, around 45, with a buzzed head and angular jaw covered in dark stubble. His coat was military style, worn and fraying, and his jeans were stiff with road dust. His eyes, a cold steel gray, studied Elias with practiced calm. "You Elias Granger?" he asked, voice gravelly, like a man who smoked too many cigarettes and trusted too few people. Elias nodded slowly, heart thumping. Theo, from behind the door, had begun to growl. not a whimper. A low, warning rumble. The man gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Rick Madsen. I think you have my dog." The silence stretched. Rick reached into his folder and pulled out 2 photographs. One was of a golden retriever puppy, clearly Theo, younger, eyes duller, sitting on concrete with a food bowl beside him. The other was a copy of a vaccination record, with a barely legible signature and a name scribbled, Max. "He's mine. Took off a few weeks ago. Must have gotten lost. I've been looking." Elias glanced down at the papers, then slowly opened the door further. Theo took one look at the man and erupted. He backed away instantly, tail tucked, barking wildly, snarling in a panic Elias had never seen in him. The golden pup darted behind Elias's legs and refused to budge, trembling violently. Rick's expression twitched. "He's just nervous," the man said quickly. "Been through a lot, but he's mine." Elias said nothing. Rick reached forward, attempting to step inside. "Look, I appreciate you taking care of him, old man, but I've got the paperwork. He's chipped. You can scan him. He's mine." At that moment, a red SUV crunched up the drive. "Lucy!" She stepped out, her thick auburn braid tucked into a wool hat, her breath fogging the air. She carried a tote full of fresh dog food and antibiotics for Pip's eye infection. Her eyes landed on Rick, then shifted to Elias, instantly reading the unease. "Is there a problem?" she asked lightly, but her hand stayed on her car door. Rick turned, lips curling. "Just reclaiming my dog. You can confirm the chip." Lucy narrowed her eyes and stepped inside without invitation. She crouched beside Theo, who was still shaking, now pressed into Elias's coat. She ran her hand along his collar, feeling for the chip. Her fingers paused, her jaw tightened. "We removed the chip 2 weeks ago, Mr. Madsen," she said evenly. "It was damaged. We scanned and recorded the old ID. It didn't match any valid registry." Rick's face darkened. "That's not what I was told." "No," Lucy said, rising. "Because I called the original clinic listed on this record. They said they've never seen your name. In fact, they said a number of their files were stolen last year during a break-in. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" His fists clenched. "Look, I didn't come here for trouble. I just want what's mine." Theo let out a sharp bark, then growled low again. Lucy's voice turned quiet, dangerous. "You ran a backyard operation in Idaho. You were fined, shut down. Your name's tied to multiple Craigslist sales. Pups that went missing or died." Rick's face went red. "You little—" "Sheriff Dale's on his way," Lucy said, crossing her arms. "Unless you want to wait in a cell, I suggest you leave." Rick hesitated, just a second too long. Then he threw the folder down, spun on his heel, and stomped back to his car. Tires spun on the frozen gravel, and then he was gone. Silence returned, sharp as glass. Theo collapsed at Elias's feet, breathing hard. The old man knelt down, wrapping both arms around the shaking pup. "He's never going back to that," Elias said, his voice breaking. Lucy looked down, her expression soft. He knew. Dogs always know. Later that night, they sat in the cabin, fire crackling, a police cruiser having already come and gone. Sheriff Dale, a broad-shouldered man with thinning hair and a kindness that hid behind a gruff demeanor, had taken the folder and promised a full investigation. He'd spoken to Lucy with quiet urgency, noting that Rick Madsen had also been cited in 2 other counties with missing animals reported. "He'll be watched," Dale had promised. Now, Elias poured Lucy a cup of tea as she sat cross-legged on the floor, Pip in her lap and Theo curled beside her. "He still won't eat," Elias muttered. "Not since this morning." Lucy nodded. "Give him time. Today ripped open something deep." Elias looked at Theo, whose eyes were now half-lidded with exhaustion. He'd stopped trembling but refused to move more than a few inches from Elias's chair. "You really think it was part of something bigger?" he asked. "I'm sure of it," she replied. "That man, he's not just someone who lost a pet. He's someone who used them." The snow fell harder now outside. The fire hissed as a log shifted. Pip purred softly. Elias thought about the lake, the frozen silence, the bundle in the reeds, and now this. There were people out there who saw life as disposable. But inside this house, at least, 2 creatures had survived that kind of cruelty. And maybe, just maybe, they would help others survive too. It began with silence, the kind of silence too deep, too perfect. like the world had exhaled and then forgotten how to breathe again. Elias Granger, now nearly 70, lay half asleep on the couch in his weathered cabin, his flannel blanket pulled to his chest, the fire dwindling to an ember's glow. Outside, the wind hissed between branches like an old curse. Inside, Theo slept curled at the foot of the couch, his small frame rising and falling with each steady breath. It had been 4 days since Rick Madsen disappeared into the storm. Sheriff Dale had filed a warrant across county lines, and Lucy had reassured Elias that Theo was safe now. The papers had started calling the rescue group Fair Hill's Quiet Heroes. But Elias didn't care about newspapers. All he cared about lay beside him, warm, golden, and loyal to the very last breath. But some shadows don't fade with daylight. Around 2:12 a.m., a dark silhouette moved across the frozen brush surrounding the cabin. He was lean, with a hood pulled low and gloves clenched tightly around a glass bottle filled with gasoline. He stepped silently across the porch, lit a rag, and launched the bottle through the side window. The shatter was immediate. The flames were faster. Glass exploded. Fire raced across the living room wall like a beast released from its cage. Elias awoke coughing violently, choking on the black smoke that now funneled through the air like poison steam. His eyes burned. His legs stumbled. But it was Theo who acted first. The little golden retriever, now 3 months old, shot through the flames like lightning, his paws skidding across the burning floorboards. He barked frantically, his voice echoing into the suffocating dark, then grabbed the end of Elias's blanket with his teeth and pulled. Elias's body thudded to the floor, unconscious, but Theo dragged him inch by inch across the wooden planks. His fur began to singe, his paws blistered. The fire roared louder. Theo found a half-burned sheet and pulled it over Elias's chest. It was all he could do. Then he turned and raced to the shattered window, barking again and again, until his voice cracked and vanished into hoarse wheezes. Somewhere in the distance, a porch light flicked on. Then another. A neighbor, Mrs. Harriet Lowe, a reclusive widow in her 80s, saw the red flicker against the trees and called 911. By the time the first fire truck reached Elias's cabin, it was nearly reduced to its bones. They found Elias unconscious but alive, lying in a half-burned blanket near the kitchen. And beside him, Theo, motionless, covered in ash, his small body curled as if still protecting his friend. The next hours blurred, flashing red lights, oxygen masks, Elias's cracked voice screaming when he awoke, "Where's my dog?" and the quiet shake of the head from the firefighter, who had held the lifeless pup in his arms. At the Fair Hill Veterinary Center, Lucy stood frozen as the fire crew brought Theo's body in a thermal wrap. His fur was blackened, one paw stiff, but his face still held that gentle softness. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed a trembling hand to his chest, feeling for a miracle. There was none. Nora Ellison, in her usual calm, signed the death certificate herself, but her hand shook for the first time in 20 years. Elias was brought to the hospital with minor smoke inhalation and a fractured wrist. When he awoke, Lucy was sitting beside him, her cheeks raw from crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He saved you." Elias turned away. No tears came at first, only silence. He stared at the ceiling and whispered one word over and over: "Theo." 2 days passed before Elias was released. He returned not to his cabin, now condemned, but to Lucy's guest room. Her house was small, 2 bedrooms, with stacks of dog crates and half-empty food bags lining the hallway. It smelled of disinfectant and warmth. That morning, Sheriff Dale came by. He wore a pressed uniform and held a single folder. His face was tight with anger. "We found gasoline traces in a wick," he said. "Standard Molotov. Same type used in 2 other arsons near Boise last year, both linked to illegal breeders." Elias said nothing. "We're working with state police," Dale continued. "We'll find him." Elias's voice finally broke. "He's already done what he wanted." Dale placed a heavy hand on the old man's shoulder. "You're still here. That matters." But Elias didn't reply. He turned and stared out Lucy's window, where a candle burned beside a small framed photo. Theo, perched in a red scarf, head tilted, eyes bright. That evening, neighbors gathered quietly near the remains of the cabin. Someone had placed flowers beside a scorched beam. A child left a hand-drawn picture of a golden puppy with wings. Lucy knelt beside Elias, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth, Theo's collar. "He didn't die in fear," she said softly. "He died doing what he chose." Elias's voice came like gravel. "I didn't deserve him." Lucy shook her head. "No one ever does. That's why they change us." As night fell, they lit a fire in the snow, not to burn, but to remember. What happened to the man who set Elias's cabin ablaze? Did justice ever catch up with those who tried to silence Theo's loyalty with fire? And how far would a grieving old man go to honor the life of a puppy who gave everything? If you believe Theo deserves justice and Elias's journey isn't over yet, comment part 2 below to let us know you're ready for the next chapter. Because sometimes the fight for what's right only begins after the ashes.